Hey guys, welcome to another tutorial. This is your host John Grand for Freshly Squeezed Samples, and today we're going to look at how to create a sub bass. Let's get into it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and load the analog BD sine, and right here, as you can see, we have a nice sine wave wavetable, which is going to be the foundation for our sub bass. Now I've already loaded some MIDI right here that you can see. And let's go ahead and hear what that sounds like. And then we're going to lower it by a couple of dB. So right there we've created a nice sub sine bass. And what we can do next, if we wanted to add some harmonics to it, is to turn on oscillator B, which already has a saw wave. So let's go ahead and drag this down by -2 as well. Make sure that it's going through the filter so that we have more control over the overall sound. Now, if you wanted to work with just a pure sine wave, then I would suggest turning off oscillator B in this scenario so that we can layer it with another bass that might be a sine wave style bass. Over here, I've already loaded a silent preset that I really like called Zeppelin, and let's go ahead and hear what that sounds like. So that bass sounds like there's a lot of low end already, right? But in order to get these two basses to really sound good together, let's go ahead and do some EQing to this one on top and this one below. But let's first listen to how they sound together. Now, as you can hear there, the sub bass is already adding a lot of low end, which is really nice, and that's going to be great when we're producing a track, and we want to be able to have that nice separation between the mid bass and the sub bass. So how do we actually create this separation so that it doesn't sound muddy? Well, the easiest thing to do is to drag an EQ, and for the purposes of this video, we're going to call this one mid bass, and then this is the sub bass. So let's go ahead and drag an EQ into each one of these. That way we can separate the frequencies. So on this sub bass, let's go ahead and look at the EQ and kind of check out where those frequencies are hitting with the sub bass. So this sub bass is currently hitting at around 100. So let's go ahead and actually lower this an octave and see what happens. Now the sub bass is hitting at the area that we kind of are targeting. This is the first octave, right? Because if we go under that, we're basically going to get hardly any kind of sound. As you can see here, that sub bass, when we lower it to -4, we're hitting that octave, which is basically unhearable, and it's just going to make your track sound really muddy. So let's bring that back to -3. Now that's a good full sub bass. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and cut as much of the highs as possible to the point where we can't really hear hardly anything else but the sub bass. And I'm going to give this one a nice and hard cut right there. Now that sounds pretty good. And one thing I want to mention too is that you can also do this within Serum by going to the EQ, selecting this right here, and then dragging it down. And there you already have your sub bass ready. Now, we've already EQ'd the sub bass, but now we need to EQ the actual mid bass. So let's go ahead and do that. As you can tell here, there's 2 octaves. Look at this. This first octave is around 60 Hertz, and that's the one that we're going to be trying to cut because we want that first octave to be hitting on the sub bass, and we want the second octave to be on the mid bass. So right there, we essentially separated the low end frequency for it to just be for the sub, and then we've also cut all the highs out of the sub so that the mid bass can really shine through. Let's play them back together and see what that sounds like. Now let's do it before and after. I'm going to turn off the EQs on both of these. I'm also going to turn off the EQ that I did on Serum. That way we can just hear what it sounds like. It just sounds a lot more full, right? You can really just hear the sub bass frequency come out. You can hear the mid bass frequency really shine through. And this separation of frequency is going to be really helpful, especially when you start changing notes and you start adding other bass patterns. Let's say, for instance, you wanted to add another layer of a bass. And let's call this one high bass. And let's give it a different preset just for the sake of this video. And let's see what this one sounds like. So let's say on this one I want to take it up to the 3rd octave. Right around there. So we've separated this bass into essentially 3 different parts: the sub bass, mid bass, and high bass. Let's go ahead and hear what that sounds like. Now that whole bass, if somebody were just listening to it, would think, wow, that's a really massive sounding bass. But essentially what we've done is we've layered the sub bass to have its own space, its own frequency range. We've done the same thing with the mid bass to kind of give it like that nice middle ground area. And then the high bass to really kind of give those highs and the fullness of a bass sound. Now, if we wanted to do something further with the sub bass, one of the things we could do is, if you wanted to, you could add a little bit of coloration to it. So what I like to do sometimes is to bring in the distortion tool within Serum, and then I like to try to mix a little bit of saturation into the sub bass just to add a little bit of harmonics. It just kind of fills it up a little bit, and it's important not to get too carried away with it, because you don't want to give it so much harmonics that the sub bass ends up sounding almost like a distorted sound, right? So the key with this is just to try to do it subtly, and you can play with different distortion sounds. And different ones are going to have different effects. The last thing that's really important to note is that your sub bass should always be completely mono. This is because stereo signals at the low end side of the frequency spectrum just don't sound good whenever they're stereoized. So you always want to make sure that you're monoing your sub bass as much as possible. That way the low end can kind of stay in the mono spectrum, and the mid bass and the high bass can be a lot more stereo, and that'll give you a lot more freedom to be able to really get your mixes to sound great. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I look forward to making more of these for you. I'll see you next time.